Krystal, and today I will be refuting the speech on polarized Congress. My opponent's claim was that our Congress is polarized to the point that it is incapable of making effective decisions. I am here to prove that although Congress is polarized, it is still capable of making effective decisions. As a reminder, my opponent's secondary claims were that the ideology of the two parties has shifted further and further apart, all other parties in the U.S. have been effectively crowded out, and that larger portions of both parties view each other as a threat to the nation. Let's first explore my opponent's first claim that the ideology of the two major parties has shifted apart. I think all of us can agree that it's no surprise Congress has been and is becoming increasingly polarized. A Gallup poll showing the disapproval rating of Congress is used by my opponent to show the failure of Congress to respond to the public. However, there is reason to believe that the contrary is true. Although there is more political polarization in the United States than ever before, it doesn't deem it to be continually unfavorable. For instance, in a bipartisan policy center poll just taken a couple months ago, the percentage who described the political divide as bad has dropped by nearly 20%, to 55% from 74%. And the number who say it's a good thing because it gives voters a real choice has doubled from 40% to 20%. Moreover, 23-year-old salesman Gage Gorilla from Caldwell, Ohio, who was among those surveys, stated, "I feel like Congress is designed to be slow, so it should be frustrating. And that's how it's designed to be. It helps stop bad policies from being passed." Moreover, in a 2013 debate, political scientist Michael Summers argued that partisanship and polarization and incremental change have been the norm, more than an exception in American history. He states that what are seen as structural obstacles or polarization in our constitution system defend the system of checks and balances. So the shift in opinion toward Congress may reflect a broadening acceptance of Washington's polarization as an inevitable fact. My opponent's second claim that all other parties in the U.S. have been effectively crowded out, causing less moderation within laws passed and Americans to choose only between two parties, is a faulty assumption. According to Alvin Barkley, professor of political science in Emory University and author Alan Abramovitz, polarization is good for democracy because other parties such as moderates and independents are generally less interested, knowledgeable, and involved segment of the population. Their influence is not nearly as great as those who tend to be more polarized. Moreover, the existence of other parties contradicts my opponent's point that effective decisions will be made because polarization clarifies the choices in elections and it helps voters to hold the parties accountable for their performance. Moderate parties and independents create a situation in which you really don't know what the parties stand for because there is so much overlap between them. Finally, my opponent's last claim that larger portions of both parties view each other as a threat of the nation and as a result are less likely to compromise do not necessarily reflect the ineffectiveness of congressional decisions. The speaker continually uses examples of polarization to point out ineffective congressional decisions, but what defines effective congressional decisions can be ambiguous. For instance, how would we know whether we have the optimal level of legislative productivity? What objective standard might be applied? If we look at this from another standpoint, Congress is doing their job. For instance, the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, which may have been argued the most productive in Congress since the 1960s, the 112th Congress passed the economic stimulus, the Affordable Care Act, the Dodd-Frank financial regulatory reforms, and more. One may reasonably agree or disagree with these policies and prescriptions, yet they certainly represent policy productivity and effectiveness. Political science Pietro Miola also stated that the Bush administration, along with President Obama's $900 million fiscal stimulus, creates a political system in which respectable activity is created rather than dysfunction relative to European nations. So as a final note, I hope you reach the opposite conclusion that the sharp political divide that defines our polarized Congress does not necessarily equate to ineffective decisions.
All right, well, the proposition and the secondary claims were labeled pretty clearly. You signpost as you get to each point. On the first point, you've got a nice counterclaim about the data. You've got different polling results that suggest that the perception of the parties is different. The perception of how effective Congress is different. I thought that that was okay. One of the things I thought was maybe missing on this point is that whether or not this polarization is, or the evidence that the advocate uses about the lack of approval of Congress, their low ratings, whether that's new or unique. In the time I've been alive, most people, that's pretty standard operating procedure. Congress is like one of the most lowest ranked government entities ever, and it's consistently down in the low teens. So it just seemed like that's an easy get for you. But you found some other information that applied to that, and I thought that that worked pretty well. You had a pretty good counterclaim on that issue also about how the Congress is supposed to work, and that there are constitutional issues that are going on here, and that it's really a reflection of the institution itself, not the membership or their opinions, that slows things down. I think that that is a pretty solid argument. I think you could use a little bit more information on that, but I think anybody who's studied American history would be familiar with the very idea that you're talking about. On the second point, the crowding out of the parties, I think I'm not sure that this argument did much to begin with, and what you've done on it is basically say it's actually good for democracy because it kind of forces the parties to be honest about what they stand for. I guess that's an interesting point. One of the other things I think you might point out is that these minor parties are crowded out mostly because the big parties are effectively representing them. If they weren't effectively representing them, you would get a break. They would separate. And the fact that minor parties can't be efficient is a reflection of the fact that there's no consensus on those other opinions. I think those are pretty obvious arguments. The way you went about it is a reasonable challenge on that. And then the last point, I thought you had a good challenge on the ambiguity of what we mean by effectiveness. You make a reference to the 112th Congress, which passed a lot of legislation, whether you approve it or not, that managed to get by. I think one of the things that you want to point out is that the question of the division of Congress being divided is more reflective of the population than it is anything else, because 2 years after we got a president and a Congress of the same party who were incredibly active, people came back and said, no, that's too much, and they changed immediately and went the other direction on those kinds of things. And so it sounds like the Congress is really much more responsive to the people than anything else, rather than the political issues. And I think that that's an opportunity that you miss. You've got a good essay here. I think there's a little bit too much reading going on in most of the presentations. Talk to us, explain to us what the issue is and why your information applies a little bit more. I know that most people have written things in eloquent ways, and especially when you're dealing with a complex reasoning issue, it's hard to just kind of explain it off at the top of your head. People write things out in a particular way and say, oh yes, that makes perfect sense to you. Well, it makes perfect sense to you if I'm reading it and I can go over it and figure out what the heck you're saying. But sometimes, remember, listeners can't do that. And so it's easier if you can clarify it. All right, thank you.